La Indolencia de los Filipinos talks about the indolence of the Filipino people as a disease of the society. Like any doctors, Jose Rizal is able to identify the symptoms, diagnose the disease, and give a cure. Today I'm going to talk about 4 contexts as to why Rizal, or at least what Rizal thinks about the indolence of the Filipinos. According to the foreigners that wrote about Filipino indolence, laziness is caused by the mismanagement of the Spanish government. By doing forced labor, importing the natives to other places, and the raiding by Moros, the population of the Philippines dropped. This drop in population decreased the production capability of the Filipinos. However, Rizal also noted that it is not only the Spanish colonial government that is at fault. Why did he say that? Because these foreign writers are Spanish friars, or at least related to the church. Spanish friar, after converting the people, turned to own estates that are tilted by the natives. The natives, tilling the land, suffer from the draining heat and with the knowledge that their produce will not be their food, and therefore will not likely to give more effort. The Spanish friars further propagated the notion that poverty is better for one to enter the heavens. This was supported by several quotes in the Bible. This in turn gave the people psychology that in order for us to be in paradise, we need to be as poor as possible. This poor, or the state of being poor, is caused by their laziness. Spanish introduced more entertainment in the form of gambling. Gambling was already in the Philippines beforehand. Example of which is sabong, which is fighting of 2 cocks or male chickens. Upon the arrival of the Spanish, more games or gambles were introduced, such as cards and lottery, caracruz, etc. Gambling promised easy money, and therefore people turned to gambling in order to acquire the money that they can have from farming. Remember that the products of the farm either go to the government official or to the friar. Therefore, people will really go to gambling in order to get the money that they need to survive. At the beginning of the essay, Rizal established that the heat is a cause of the indolence, since the Spanish are lazier than the French, and the German is more industrious than the French. However, this notion is not just based on the heat. But as you can see on this map, here is Spain, here is France, here is Germany. As you move north, people are whiter, and as you move south, people are darker. You see, the notion is not just about geography, it's about the stereotypes of the races. That blacks, or darkers, are not good as whites. Since Filipinos are not white people, then the whites would likely to put that the Indios are inferior. This notion of inferiority is passed on to the natives, and some of the native elites think of their brethren as inferior. The notion of some other races as being inferior can be passed on from one another. After all, notions are not stagnant. As an effect, the inferior race will think of them as inferior, and therefore will not strive to work their best, even though they are good at it.
The Spaniards, the Filipinos were actually hardworking and industrious. However, after the Spanish era was over, the Filipinos were then labeled as lazy and indolent. Because of this, the Filipinos were robbed of various things, such as trades with other countries. The galleon trade was the only business conducted with Spain, so all the relationships between Middle East and other Asian countries were cut off. Another is that Filipinos were forced to do labor because the Spaniards needed manpower in the construction of their facilities. Well, there are many other reasons as to why it seemed the Filipinos were labeled as lazy. But then, the arrival of the Spaniards had a big part in making it seem so. For now, I would discuss society and culture together because they are intertwined. So as mentioned previously, the Spaniards got the Filipinos for their own works. So forced labor was done by the Filipinos. So instead of doing agriculture, commerce, and other works, the Filipinos had to do the construction of ships, bridges, and many others. Forced labor is really difficult since it's hard to work on something you don't love to do. So I guess that paved the way for Filipinos being labeled as lazy because yun nga, nakakatamad gawin. Another is that in their society back then, the Spanish officials were very lazy in their work. They used to arrive at noon time, and they always had an early exit. So, with that, seeing the leaders being lazy themselves in their society, I guess it trickled down to the Filipinos being lazy as well. Another is that the education of the Filipinos were suppressed because the Spaniards didn't want the Filipinos to be educated, so that no rebellion would be staged that would dethrone the Spaniards of their power. So in addition to culture, the Philippines has been known to be a tropical country, and because of this, the heat is very extreme. It taps into the energy of the person, so it makes it seem normal that people would take rest times in between their work. So because of this, I think that led to a reason to believe that the Filipinos were lazy because they were easily exhausted, they rested a lot, and they didn't want to work under dull hours, under the sun for many. In terms of psychology, as to why the Filipinos were labeled as lazy and indolent, one of the biggest reasons for that is that the friars or the government officials themselves were lazy. They came in at noon and checked out really early, so that did not motivate the Filipinos. There was this thinking of bakit kami magtatrabaho ng sobra-sobra kung yung leaders nga namin hindi nila mapakita na kailangan sobrang dedicated sa work. So I think that yung thinking na yun, it produced an effect which led to the Filipinos being somewhat lazy and less motivated to do their work.
Indolence is still a problem to the modern Philippine society. One example of this is that people are so reliant to their government that some are barely working on their improvement of their own condition or of others. There is no more the notion of bayanihan. Modern Filipinos think of their families only, and beyond that, nothing else. This is why the Philippines as a whole still does not progress. However, a larger problem to this modern society is the colonial mentality. I just realized that Rizal was not able to diagnose indolence itself. That is why the cures he has prescribed seem to have not worked. He was not able to see that the tumor, even though removed, the cancer still can grow back. The effects of mentality of indolence has given birth to colonial mentality. We still believe that we are the inferior race, and we strive to develop ourselves to the image of the West. What has become of this? Well, we tend to forget more of our heritage, our past knowledge. We tend to follow the trend the West has set, and we never strive to develop things on our own. We have become puppets. In an academic term, neo-colonials. So what now? Are we going to be forever neo-colonials? Think about that.
The norm during the Spanish era was that women were not allowed to work and to study, and they were only taught things that were going to be useful once they become housewives and mothers, which was why it was such a shock when the women of Malolos actually asked to be able to study and to even learn Spanish. Challenging the norm and trying to break the image of women doing nothing but housework and raising children was something that needed to be recognized which was why Luna asked Rizal to write to the women of Malolos. For Rizal, the women played an important role in shaping the society. And because the Spaniards knew about the capabilities of the Filipino women, they actively suppressed and limited their role in society. When we actually compare the women from Asia and the women from Europe, we could really tell the differences in terms of their freedom and rights. And because of this, Rizal gave recognition to the women of Malolos who were very courageous in voicing out their opinion and fighting for their right to education. He sees them actually as a role model to other women and also hopes that they will be an inspiration and be able to influence others to actually also fight for their rights and to have a voice that will be heard in society.
Sa mga kababayang dalaga sa Malolos, written by Jose Rizal, is not actually fiction. This was written by Jose Rizal due to a circumstance that happened to real life women of Malolos, Bulacan. So, on December 12, 1888, a group of women composed of 12 members from Malolos, Bulacan approached Governor General Weyler and petitioned to open an evening school to teach Spanish classes with the help of Teodoro Sandico. However, this was not agreed upon by Father Felipe Garcia, who was the parish priest of Malolos during that time. So, because of this, the Governor General also disapproved this request. This, however, did not stop the women of Malolos to pursue the request. And because of that pursuit and because of that of their determination, eventually the request was approved, but with the condition that Senora Guadalupe Reyes would be their teacher. So this was not the norm during the time of the Spaniards, since women during the Spanish era were seen as the meek type and not the aggressive ones. So they conventionally followed whatever they are told to do, especially with what the church dictated them to do, since Catholicism really played an important role in the colonization of the Philippines. So this unusual pursuit done by these women of Malolos was noticed by Del Pilar, which then had this vision to inspire more women to be like them and to stand up for their rights, to stand up for themselves, to be more opinionated and be more open. So he asked Dr. Jose Rizal to write about this in the form of a letter addressed to these women. So this was the history of how this material was written. So in terms of economics, it was mentioned that the priests or friars continue to indulge the money that was paid to them, or they continue to become rich because of that, because of the indulgence that was paid to them. So what is an indulgence? So indulgence is the money that is paid to them in order to absolve oneself from his or her sins. So if one wants to go to heaven, one will pay a greater amount of money in order to be forgiven for whatever they have done in the past. So because of this flow of money, their corruption during that time was inevitable, especially that the money goes directly to the priests. So there was a big chunk of money that goes to the Catholic Church during that time. So this exposed how the priests abused that power to or their power, and have made money out of the fear of the Filipinos of being damned in heaven. So clearly from the title itself, sa mga kababayang dalaga sa Malolos, we can see that the obvious angle in this reading or in this material is about gender. So it was clearly seen how gender during the Spanish era played a major role on the Filipinos. So it was actually, we can see the dichotomy between men and women. So men were more superior than women. So as mentioned in the society part, that they were living in a patriarchal society. So it was obvious that men were really dominated, or really were really above women during that time. Um, as mentioned also, uh, Catholicism or the church really influenced how women were portrayed, or how women um, should act in society. So there were individual roles for them. So it was seen, or it was mentioned that women's roles were just at home, and mostly focused on prayer, that they were just supposed to be praying the novena all the time, that they were portrayed as very religious women, and very obedient women to what the Catholic Church, or what the priests or friars dictated them to do. And it was shown that they happily obliged. They followed whatever was dictated to them. And it was also mentioned that since that women are portrayed as mothers as well, and because of this, it was pointed out that since women were blindly following the friars' conditions and restrictions, um, the religious practices were passed on to their children as well. So since these practices were passed on to their children, Jose Rizal was actually worried or bothered that these were the only things that the children, the future generation, would know, that only to pray, only to be meek, only to follow what the church told them to do. And it was not something that they needed during that time. So there. And another thing that we could point out is that the only reason that Governor General Whaler agreed to have evening classes um, was that um, the condition of them was to learn in, or was to be taught by Senora Guadalupe Reyes. And Senora Guadalupe Reyes is a woman, and we can see that women were treated as someone low in society. And because of this, we can see that a woman teaching other women was not something bothersome for them, since Senora Guadalupe is not a man, we can say. She wouldn't have that much influence or that much power as compared to if the teacher would be a man. So that's how they treated women during that time. That's how they saw them, as someone inferior to them in society. So in terms of politics, the power rests in the friars or the priests who controlled Catholicism at that time. So besides men who dictated the roles of women in society, it was them who dictated the roles. So, however, this was challenged by the women of Malolos when they still pursued and fought for their right to learn Spanish. So there was actually a challenge in power between the priests who were dictating what a woman should be or what a woman should do, and the women who were treated as inferior. So examples were actually given by Rizal, wherein women were supposed to only pray, do the novena, kiss the hands of the priest, and all that. So there. In terms of race and ethnicity, so the Filipinos, most especially the Indios, were seen as inferior, especially women who are Filipinos or who are Indios. So it was seen that Filipino women Filipino women are said to be very obedient, which actually explains how they easily obliged with the restrictions of the Catholic Church and the Spaniards. So they followed blindly with what the Catholic Church or what the priests dictated them to do. So if they were told to pray every day, um, they they happily oblige. So there. Um, it was seen how Filipino women were portrayed by being the conventional meek, the conventional sunod-sunuran, or those who can stand up for themselves, as compared to European women who are more free to do whatever they want, who are more vocal with their opinions. So that's how the dichotomy was shown through this. But it was then challenged by the unconventional dalaga ng mga Malolos, who stood up for what they wanted and who stood up for their rights to learn. So the society they were living in was in a patriarchal society, which means that men were superior over women. Other than that, the society that they were in was in a Spanish colonized based society. So wherein they are influenced by the Spanish through Catholicism, wherein Catholicism, it was the Spanish's way to dictate how the Filipinos would act, and especially the women, the roles of the women were dictated by the priests and by the rules of the said Catholic Church during that time.
In a psychological context, the women during the Spanish era were conditioned to think a certain way, and that is to become a housewife and a mother when they grow up. So women during that time, they were raised by their mothers and taught things that were only going to be useful when they become housewives and mothers themselves. So this limits the women in terms of thinking outside of the box and dreaming to become professionals because they are honed and raised to think only a certain way. During the Spanish era, the priests and friars were greatly looked up upon and well respected by the people. Their word was sacred and was considered the same as that of God's, but this is where the problem arises, because there is blind obedience, as people will just follow whatever the priests tell them without even thinking critically. People were very religious and thus would agree to anything that the friars would say. There were even instances wherein the women were actually taken advantage of by the friars. When we're talking about men and women, it's very obvious that there has been progress in terms of equality between the two. When you compare the state of women during the Spanish era and the state of women today are actually allowed to vote, they can now study, and they can work in their chosen professions. But we can't deny the fact that men and women are still not completely equal. There are still some people who think that women are actually more inferior than men, or that they can do certain things, or they're not allowed to do certain things just because of the fact that they're women. But hopefully in the future, since people nowadays, they're more open-minded, they're more accommodating to women, and as well as the rights of the women and what women want. Hopefully in the future there will be complete equality between the two genders, and having equality between the genders means that there is no specific gender which is more superior, or there's no gender that's inferior to the other. There's just